first Rugby World Cup. This is the tournament that helped pave the way for rugby union to become the fully professional sporting enterprise that we know and love today. The tournament was hosted by Australia and New Zealand from May 22nd to June 20th of 1987, about 8 years before the sport of rugby union became fully professional. In a lot of ways, the growing desire to pay players and give rugby union a grander stage is what led to the first Rugby Union World Cup. By the way, guys, I'm an American YouTuber making videos about rugby union and rugby league. So you might be asking, why is an American making these videos? Well, it's pretty simple. I love these sports so much and no one else is making videos like these. So I really wanted to see them. I want to learn about the history and things, and I'm sharing that with you guys. So please be sure to check out my other videos, like I did one on the Clash of the Codes in 1995. If you like these videos, make sure to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching. During the early years of rugby union, national teams from other hemispheres would usually do long tours and stay in the host countries for up to 2 months at a time. Think British and Irish Lions tours. The important regional tournament to predate the World Cup is the Six Nations tournament, or Five Nations when it was back then. As well, some rugby enthusiasts considered the matches between South Africa and New Zealand to be the de facto World Championship of rugby, as those two nations were considered the undisputed two best national teams of the day. Did you know that Rugby Union 15s was also represented in 4 Olympiads? Rugby union was an Olympic competition at the 1900, 1908, 1920, and 1924 Olympiads, but we don't really talk about them because they suck so bad. These tournaments did not even come close to representing the best of what rugby had to offer. Usually the Olympic tournaments had 2 to 3 teams. For example, rugby at the 1908 Olympics contained only Australia, Asia, and Great Britain, and that's it. But the last country to win a Rugby 15s tournament in the Olympics is the United States of America. Yeah, my country. I can't imagine how proud I would have been to see the Stars and Stripes being held high after winning a terribly organized rugby tournament that almost no one gave a shit about. Think about the year of the first Rugby Union World Cup in 1987. Compared to other sports, that's really late. You have association football, that's soccer, in 1930, handball in 1938, one-day cricket, 1975. Hell, even the Rugby League World Cup started in 1954, even though it had only 4 teams. The IRFB, or International Rugby Football Board, which I'll just name IRB from here on after, actually cited the Rugby League World Cup as a reason why they didn't want to have their own World Cup in Union. Poor Rugby League. It was quite difficult convincing the IRB to consider the idea. The rugby union higher-ups were so set in what they considered the spirit of amateurism that they rejected even having national club champions. In fact, France is the only country who has a long history of national competition. South Africa's Currie Cup and New Zealand's provincial championships only came into existence in 1968 and 1976 respectively. In the early 1980s, amateurism was again under threat. Many top union players, especially from Australia, were crossing the lines into rugby league to get a paycheck. French players were more or less getting compensated for their playing time, with the IRB turning a blind eye to this. Association football was gaining a foothold in New Zealand, especially after the All Whites, their soccer team, qualified for the World Cup in 1982. Australia and New Zealand were determined something had to be done to highlight the game that they loved. To give you an idea of the mindset of a strict amateurist rugby ideology, I give you a passage from Wavell Wakefield in 1971 from the publication called Touchdown. Wakefield, a fully paid member of the IRB, was a former captain of England and president of the English RFU. This is what he said: "I hope that it does not happen. The rugby union made it clear that the main object is an amateur game, played for recreation and enjoyment by people who spend the rest of the week at work. A World Cup is quite enough an ordeal for us soccer players whose living it is. For amateur rugby players, it would introduce a much too demanding complication into their daily lives. Just wow." And it's very clear that having a World Cup would have made it all but certain that union would creep closer and closer to professionalism. How could any player take 50 days off work, dedicate that entire time to just playing rugby, and still be considered an amateur player? Makes you wonder. In 1982, the South African Rugby Board, probably in a tantrum that it couldn't play due to its cruel and disgusting apartheid laws, started to threaten that they would make a professional rugby circuit. Australian players refused to tour New Zealand because their daily allowance was too small. In 1983, Australian David Lord made a plan to pay more than 200 of the top players to play in a traveling 8-team competition. This didn't fully get up and running, but the idea was there. Again in 1984, France also made a proposal for the World Cup to the IRB. The requests were coming in from all sides. The IRB had their backs to the wall. They had to do something. With that said, the IRB asked Australia and New Zealand to come up with a feasibility study on possibly hosting a World Cup. In order to approve a World Cup, it would have to be put to a vote. Back then, the IRB consisted of 8 countries, each with 2 votes apiece. They were the 4 home nations, Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, as well as France, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. During this time, South Africa was almost entirely shut out of international sporting competitions due to their apartheid laws. However, despite this, they were still very influential in the IRB. They still attended meetings, although their votes did not officially count. From the beginning, it was clear that Australia and New Zealand favored a World Cup. South Africa's leading voice, Danny Craven, understood clearly that apartheid's days were numbered and that South Africa would one day soon be able to host the World Cup themselves, which they did eventually do in 1995. They helped influence IRB members into voting for a World Cup even though they did not actually get a vote. France was always nominally in favor of a World Cup, and French President Albert Ferras only needed the assurance that non-IRB members, namely Romania, Italy, and Argentina, would be assured spots in the World Cup as well. With that assurance given, there were now 6 votes in favor. However, the 4 home nations, which were 8 votes total, had been strictly against hosting a World Cup. England's John Kendall Carpenter and Welshman Keith Rowlands were able to be convinced of the benefits of such a World Cup and switched their votes at the last minute. This gave the total of 8 votes in favor and 6 against. With that, the voting ended and the World Cup was approved for 1987. The first Rugby Union World Cup contained 16 teams. 7 of the IRB members, which were included, sans South Africa. That left several well-known rugby countries to be invited: Italy, Argentina, Japan, Romania, Tonga, and Fiji. As well, the United States and Canada, who had modified forms of rugby as popular sports in their countries, were invited. The only interesting and unusual country was Zimbabwe, which was invited to help drive interest for the sport in Africa, since South Africa wouldn't be competing. The tournament saw games being played about once a week, which was a big change in the world of rugby union at the time. English hooker Brian Moore described the format, stating, "We had never played in a tournament other than the 5 nations, and even then you went home after the game and only played once every 2 weeks, sometimes once a month." Regardless, the group stage was dominated by IRB members, where they won by an average of 37 points. The closest a non-IRB member came to winning a game was Tonga's 16-29 loss to Wales by 13 points. Half of the 24 matches across the 4 pools saw one team score 40 or more points. Most of the games between IRB and non-IRB members were one-sided, to say the least. The first pool saw Australia and England advancing against the United States and Japan. The United States dominated Japan in a blowout 21-18 win, before eventually losing a tough-fought game to Australia, and then narrowly losing again to England by a margin of 34-6. Australia beat England in Sydney 19-6 to win the top seed in the pool. In Pool 2, Ireland and Wales advanced against Canada and Tonga. Wales beat Ireland to a crowd of 17,000 in Wellington to take the top seed there. Pool 4 saw France and Scotland advancing against Romania and Zimbabwe. France and Scotland tied 2020 in Christchurch to 18,000 fans. France had the higher seed due to having more total points. In Pool 3, there was Fiji, Italy, Argentina, and New Zealand. This was the only pool with only one IRB team, and I guess not surprisingly, this was the only pool where each team won at least one game. The Kiwis, of course, dominated the entire group, winning by an average of 51 points. A lot of pressure was on New Zealand, though. The previous year, they traveled to South Africa for an unofficial Cavaliers tour. Not only did it not fare well, they alienated a large amount of their fan base who thought the tour was a soft acceptance of South Africa's cruel apartheid policies. New Zealand's coach, Sir Brian Lockwood, described the situation. They were the fittest team there by a considerable margin. They wanted to win back the public. At the beginning, they wouldn't go downtown with anything that identified them as All Blacks in case they got abused. But by the end of the tournament, they were proud to walk down the street and be acknowledged. The quarterfinals saw 7 of the IRB members advancing along with Fiji, so it was quite predictable in that way. Wales beat England 16-3 in what is sometimes known as one of the worst World Cup games in history. New Zealand had its first real competition with Scotland, but eventually won 30-3. They only won by 27 points instead of the usual 50, so that's a start. France beat Fiji 31-16, and Australia ran over Ireland 33-15. Probably the best match of the tournament came in a semi-final clash between Australia and France. Taking place on Concord Oval in Sydney, Australia, the game saw 17,000 Australia fans cheering their way to the finals. France did well to come from behind 3 times to overcome Australia and clinch the win. With the scores level 24-all near the end of the game, it seemed certain to go to extra time. France pulled out what is considered one of the best tries in Rugby World Cup history. Deep in their own territory, they ran the ball through the hands of 11 players, both forwards and backs, before an amazing display by Serge Blanco, which led to the try. France stunned the Wallabies, winning 30-24. New Zealand beat Wales 49-6, nothing surprising there, and by a margin of 43 against a very well-established team. The final saw 48,000 plus to see France take on New Zealand. The game looked within reach for France at the end of the first half, with New Zealand only scoring 9 points total. France came out strong in the second half, scoring a penalty to start things off. However, New Zealand came out even stronger, scoring 2 tries by David Kirk and John Kerwin, and having perfect goal-kicking accuracy, which led to their victory of 29-9. New Zealand won only by 20 points, which was the lowest margin of victory in the entire tournament for them. France started their somewhat common practice of losing in the Rugby World Cup finals. So close, yet so far away. Looking at the statistics, it's clear that New Zealand dominated. The top 5 try scorers were all from New Zealand, as well as the overall point score. Their efforts clearly established the All Blacks as the best rugby nation in the world by far. The 1987 Rugby World Cup was a must-do global occasion for rugby union. It sped up talks for professionalism and showed the world that rugby could receive an even grander stage. It improved playing standards and finally solved the question of who played the best rugby in the world. Well, that's it, guys. I hope you liked the video, and thanks for watching. Check me out next time. Bye.